This is about trying to bring that big, far-flung network from all over the world, multiple generations, from folks who have just finished college to folks who have been some of the leading thinkers in the world for many decades.
This is a chance to bring people together who not only have different points of view and are different places on the political spectrum, but also have different expertises and different knowledge perspectives. We wanted to be outside of Washington, D.C. because thinking in big political capitals like Washington gets very narrow, it gets very short term. We wanted to get people to broaden their perspective a bit.
In the summer of 2011, in the shadow of the Golden Gate Bridge just outside San Francisco, the Breakthrough Institute held its inaugural Breakthrough Dialogue. The dialogue and the Breakthrough Journal, a quarterly forum launched the same month, are intended to work out the next generation of ideas that will get us beyond today's polarized and paralyzing politics.
The driving vision behind the Breakthrough Journal over the long term is to create a sort of space for thought that is new and courageous and is risk-taking in many ways, where there isn't necessarily a venue for it in other journals or other publications.
One of the big questions in this conference is how do you engage young people in political activity or in the processes of government, or even in an interest in government.
A lot of young people are actually getting repoliticized as a result of all these crises that we are facing. And they're starting to ask these questions. I mean, how do we move forward? What kind of Spain or Greece or Germany do we want to live in? And what kind of Europe do we want to be a part of?
The argument of the conference is, yes, liberalism can open us up to new hopes and possibilities by attacking entrenched conceptual frameworks.
I think that conservatism can be understood as a branch of liberalism. I mean, most conservatives say they're for individual liberty. Liberals say the same thing. But there are different understandings of what liberty means, and there are different understandings about what are the best policies to secure and advance liberty, and that's where the disagreements come out.
Disagreement and political conflict can be a very healthy thing. I get very suspicious of situations where everybody agrees.
The dialogue began with the discussion of risks to societies and the ways in which arguments about those risks are always about power and ideology.
Raise your hand if you want to take a shot at the objective true meaning of bad. That's what risk means. There is no objective risk.
The problem isn't that we don't have enough objectivity. The problem is that we have many different ways to construct an objective, scientifically valid view of the world, and those ways can be constructed so that they match our preferences about what the world ought to look like and what we ought to do.
When you try to assess the risk of terrorism, it's very complicated, of course, because as is the case with many different kinds of political and social phenomena, you can't just quantify risk when it comes to terrorism. If you understand the way a group is structured, you can get a better sense of a kind of a broad approximation of the risk. And unfortunately, in the United States and in many other countries, there's this tendency to go way beyond where that approximation is, either overstating it or understating it.
Whoever gets to own the risk discussions gets to own politics in two very, very powerful ways. One is on the moral front, and the second is on the front of authoritative claims about what counts as objective reality.
We actually bring our own ideologies and our own idea of the world to the way that we understand the things that we worry about and to the risks of the world.
But until the politics itself has been resolved, the science actually ends up having the effect of reinforcing and actually making worse the controversy, and this is exactly what we're seeing.
One risk the group explored was inequality, but with a 21st century twist.
Well, the New Deal was enormously successful in eliminating breadlines. It was great at taking care of basic material goods that we all need in a modern society. But we're in a new world now. We're in an affluent society, even in economic hard times. And so we need a new deal, a new deal, a real deal, which addresses the things that are stressing out American families. And those happen to be, unfortunately, what Fred Hirsch once called positional goods.
Conservatives should think more about income inequality, not because inequality of incomes is itself a bad thing, but because at some point it may reflect the breaking down of social mobility.
A lot of folks like to think about inequality as the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. But what's really happening is the rich are getting richer, full stop. And that's a more difficult issue to tackle because we don't want to just be vengeful and make the rich poor because we're not them. We want to lift all boats.
The problem in the last 20, 30 years, it's not clear that a rising tide is lifting all boats, it's lifting the yachts.
At the core of any modernization of liberalism must be an economic agenda that drives vigorous growth and widespread prosperity. And that must involve rethinking the proper role of the state.
The problem, or really in many ways the fundamental failure of liberalism, is that they can't really offer a coherent agenda. And what they go back to is saying, well, if we just go back to where we were in the 50s and 60s, we'll just make government bigger, we'll regulate companies more, we'll make sure that we'll have high taxes on the rich and distribute the money a little more. The period after World War II was seen by a lot of people as the golden era of the American economy, where incomes, for example, in the 1960s, real worker incomes, inflation adjusted, went up 30%. And you know, it's a complicated story as to why that happened. I think it really happened because of technology. We just had this explosion of mass production technology.
Technological innovation in the long run is the single most important thing in economics, whether in the US perspective or the global perspective. Basically, in the last 200 years, we've gone from a planet where most people were unfree farm laborers living at the margins of starvation to, by the year 2100, most human beings will live in cities, or at least slums, and will be urban and industrial workers in an electrified, automobilized, computerized world. This is the most remarkable transformation in history. It comes almost entirely from the development of new technology.
There was a pretty big recognition that the government has a role in innovation.
We've seen that from everything from building the railroads and canals that first united our country over a century ago, to microchips and the internet and broadband and even the iPhone, where all of the core technologies inside it really were developed with the support of the U.S. government, whether it's the microchips at its core, or the radio technology that forms cell phone technology, or the GPS system, which is launched by the the military, that helps you know where you are all the time in your smartphone.
There's a role for the state to enable enterprises to become more productive, more innovative, and more competitive. The left looks at enterprises as, at worst, sort of Benedict Arnold corporations. They're on their own, they're just out to screw the American worker, and at best maybe something that you might help, but only if it's related to maybe green energy or minority-based jobs or things like that. And unless you have an economic doctrine, an economic philosophy that says we have got to figure out a way to get back to what's good for GM and what's good for the country, in other words, to align corporate interests to the U.S. interest to create good jobs here, you can't have a coherent economic philosophy.
The premise of neoliberalism as it matured in the 1990s and then the 2000s under Bill Clinton and arguably George W. Bush was that the world is moving away from economic nationalism towards a rule-governed global market, which would be like the United States market. Corporations would make their decisions about where to locate production on the planet on the basis of purely economic considerations. And because this would lead to enhanced global welfare, all countries everywhere would benefit from this simultaneously. No one outside of the English-speaking world believes this theory.
We actually understand more and more how economies work, over the long term, why they grow. There's an important role for the state, and that role is something that publics around the world, particularly in developed democracies, increasingly are skeptical about. So what do you do about that?
We have to be thinking about a way to persuade the public that they are connected to the state in ways that are deeply legitimate.
Any political ideology that wants to remain relevant must deal with the complex relationship between economic development and the environment, as well as deal with one of the century's most daunting issues, that of climate change.
In science, it's very important to ask the right questions. And the questions that we asked is, what would we need to run the planet in 2050 without CO2 emissions?
The National Ignition Facility over here at the Lawrence Livermore Lab is on the brink of getting success with fusion that is run by light. This is laser light hitting a peppercorn-sized piece of hydrogen, tritium actually. And If that goes forward, if we get ignition in the next year, then you are close to being able to get a real engine which can do these capabilities of really clean, really scalable, really grid electricity, and that would change everything.
We're all pretty skeptical about this idea that we're going to sort of technocratically manage the entire sort of planetary ecosystem. And on the other hand, we are sort of functionally doing it.
In my mind, conservation is about painting a vision for the future of the world. And it's a future that obviously includes nature. But unless you think about the future of the world, you'll never have a future of nature.
One of the biggest challenges for environmentalism is to stop sort of looking back to, pristine nature in its old form and sort of going back to the land and this idea that we'll restore nature to some state it was in before, and to really look forward and think about, what kind of world do we want to create, what kind of nature do we want to live in this century, and how can we unleash human innovation to achieve that?
You go to any website, of any of the environmental groups, including my environmental group, Nature Conservancy, and if you look up things, you'll see things like the fragile river, the fragile desert. You could find books, and you'll see children holding the globe in their hands, and it'll talk about the fragile world. Well, my experience, on-the-ground experience, going to places that have been devastated, and hardcore scientific data says quite the contrary. You want to find the most thriving populations of endangered mammals and birds in Russia, you go to Chernobyl. In the Bikini Atoll, the U.S. did its last big hydrogen bomb test. It vaporized islands. It boiled the ocean. Go back there now, and there's more coral than there was ever there.
So for example, you could take the band-tailed pigeon, get some DNA from some of the stuffed passenger pigeons that are out there. I'm working with George Church on looking through the realities of this. It looks like it will work, that you can basically convert the band-tailed pigeon into a passenger pigeon and bring back the most iconic of all the extincted animals.
Any practical solutions to our many 21st century challenges like climate change must deal with the realities of today's polarized politics and find a way beyond it.
Liberal and conservative are really just surface labels for something that's underneath going on that's much more profound.
Political controversies around climate are worse than they were 20 years ago. We know a whole lot more, and there's a reason those two go together, and that's because we've asked the science to do something it's not meant to do, which is to resolve the value disputes that are the core of the climate change problem. That is the what should we do about climate change problem.
Pragmatism in the sense of policy is what works. And in many complex issues, the reality is we don't know what actually works. That's one of the frustrations. The best designs of the smartest intellectuals often crash and burn. We saw that with the global financial crisis. So on energy innovation, on climate change, it's important that we open up the space to new ideas.
The breakthrough dialogues and the continuing conversation in the new Breakthrough Journal represent important efforts to get beyond the partisan clash of today's liberalism and conservatism and come up with the next generation of big, transformative ideas that will lead the way forward.
The thinkers are always ahead of the doers, I'll put it that way. And so the thinking classes on both left and right and middle may say, here's the ground of a reasonable compromise that makes the most sense and maximizes everybody's welfare. But the doers in the world, the people who organize political activists, who worry about elections and try and mobilize voters and get money and all the rest of that, their interests are in not making that compromise or in screwing it up.
When I first came to the US in 1978, I came from Britain, which was highly polarized politically. And I was struck when I came here 30-odd years ago by the amount of bipartisanship in politics, and I was very impressed by that, in fact.
The kind of conversation that we were having, the kind of dialogue where you're finding places where you obviously, there's disagreement, but also places where there's new kinds of agreement, that's really, there's hope there. That there was actually some, I think a sense of optimism that could flower into a new politics, into a new way of getting important things done.
It's going to be a rowdy century. I think it'll be a fantastic century to live through because so much profound stuff is going to be going on.